You are listening to the Examine Life with Bram Levinson. Well. We meet again. It's been a while. I have taken a couple of weeks away from the microphone, and that wasn't something that was intentional. It's sort of the byproduct of the other stuff that I have planned for the year. And that's because I've decided that hopefully on my birthday, on October 17th of this year, I'm going to do another show, another theater show. I did one a couple of years ago, and if you want to sort of have an idea of what that is or what that looked like or what that sounded like, you can find it on YouTube. It's called We're Still Here, One Night Only with Bram Levinson. And I decided that I was going to do another one later this year. As I got back from Italy about 3 weeks ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago, I was tired from giving that trip and just from the wear and tear of travel. And trust me, I love travel and I will continue traveling, but it's taxing. And I got back and I just thought, you know what? I need to really think about what I want to do over the next 11 and a half months and not just sort of repeat what I did last year or the year before. It's very easy for me to get into a rhythm, and it's very easy for me once I've done something for the first time, like the Italy trip. That was the first time I've gone to Rome with a group. And when things go so well and so smoothly and so effortlessly, it's very easy for me to say, okay, you know what, I'm just going to keep doing this. I'll keep repeating this and offering this to more people. And while there may be other people who would want to, I guess, experience whatever the event is or whatever the experience is, I realize that if I keep doing the same things over and over and over again, I'm just going to get so bored that I'm not going to really give a shit about whatever it is I'm doing. And ultimately, I need to be passionate about it. I need to care about it. It needs to challenge me. I need to feel like I'm learning. And, last year was the first time that I gave the yoga and meditation retreat in England. And I had one scheduled for April of this year, of 2020. And when I came back from Italy, I really made the decision that I wasn't going to do it. I took it off of my schedule and basically just paid attention to signs, really. It just would have been too much. 10 years ago, I had set an intention to do 3 trips a year. And last year, 2019, it took me 9 years to really build that. Last year was the first year that I did it, and it was too much for me. With everything else that I do, it was too demanding, it was too taxing. And so I decided I was going to drop England, and for the time being anyway, keep England as, the place where I go to in the world to completely unplug. And so I will do that instead of giving the trip there. I'll go there to just rest. And I know that for many of you, you must be thinking, oh, like I'm playing the smallest violin for you. So it must be so hard to travel all over the world. But the truth is that when I do give a trip, it's work. It is a lot of work, and I'm fully on. And I take a lot of responsibility for not only what happens within the time of whatever the event is that I'm giving, but I take a lot of responsibility for probably things that I don't need to, but ultimately it's my name on it, on whatever that trip is. And I want to make sure that everybody has a wonderful experience that is free from suffering and free from pain. And I don't want anybody to get hurt. And I just want people to have a great time. I want to give them a moment that they're always going to remember. And it's a lot. It's a lot. So I'm going to go to England just to be with my, extended family over there and to really unplug and not have a trip associated to work. Because typically most of the places that I go to as a tourist, I tack on to before I give a city break or a yoga vacation or a retreat or after. And so, yes, I find myself somewhere around the world, but I also find myself, if it's tacked on before whatever the event is, I'm not relaxed, right? There's anticipation, there's preparation. If it's tacked on after, typically there's a period of my nervous system coming down that usually takes a day or two. And maybe sometimes like getting sick. That used to happen more years ago, but anything is possible. And so I'll go to England, just have that downtime for me and for me alone, and try to unplug from work for as much as possible. Not because, I dislike my work at all. In fact, yesterday a friend of mine said to me, how old do you think you're going to be, or how long do you think you're going to do this thing, teaching yoga? And he said, actually, his words were, what age do you think you're going to retire from teaching yoga? And I said, I'll probably do it until the day that this body goes, because frankly, I love what I do, right? And I think I may have said this in a previous episode of the podcast, but I flippantly will say, when somebody asks me about retirement, I will flippantly respond, retirement is for people who don't like what they do with their time. Retirement is for people who don't like whatever it is that they're doing that allows them to earn the money to live the rest of their life. And I know that that's unfair and pretty much a shitty thing to say. So I usually say it with a little bit like tongue-in-cheek kind of sense of humor. But for me, there is, why would I retire? I love what I do. And I love being able to help other people and guide them to a place where their experience of life is more enjoyable and more of the shit that they want it to be. And so, will I teach yoga per se for the rest of my time? I don't know. But I don't have any plans to stop. It's just one of those branches. It's one of those limbs, with which I can accomplish what my intention is. And that intention is to accompany other people and to accompany them to a place where, they're better. They feel better. Their thoughts are better. All of it. So I'm going to take the time that I need, vacation, just to sort of unplug a little bit. And typically when I do that, when I end up in England on these trips, occasionally I take like a Skype session with someone who would like one, here and there. But ultimately it's really an excuse for me to just pretend that I'm 14 and don't have one responsibility in the world, because when I do go there, my friends kind of let me just completely unplug. I do dishes occasionally, which I don't do at home. Little factoid for you. I help out around the house over there at my friend's home. But ultimately there's no timetable, there's no schedule, and for me 2 weeks of that is a luxury. My friends are very, very kind to me. So I'll go to do that. But ultimately, what I decided, once I sort of dropped the England retreat, what I decided was I was going to do another show. And the reason for doing the show is simply because that medium, that environment, I don't do very often. In fact, I've done once, really, in my life in this context. And it's a very, very unique experience. It's an opportunity for me to have one-on-one interaction with many, many, many people at once, which can happen in a yoga or asana class, but ultimately this is an opportunity for people who would never walk into a yoga studio to spend some time with me and for me to spend time with them. And to do it in a group environment where I guess the setting is a little bit more elaborate and amped up. And for me, it's a challenge because it's a risk financially, right? Because I rent the theater that I do the show in. But ultimately, it's just a different public speaking gig for me. It's a different way for me to do what I do. And while seen through a certain lens, there's no difference for me between standing at the front of a room in a yoga class and speaking versus, standing at the front of a theater and being on a stage and speaking. There is, I guess, the brain works in funny ways. And so it would be easier for me to be intimidated by the theater setting. And so ultimately, I like to do things that test this core belief that I have. And that core belief is that everything is going to be fine. Everything is already fine. And ultimately, the second we find ourselves in resistance to something or nervous about something, it's because we've created a relationship to it that is unhealthy. And we are seeing it in a certain way. And in some ways, we are giving whatever it is more power than we believe we have. And so I like to put myself in situations like this so that I can remind myself what the work is, the cognitive work, the spiritual work, to not be intimidated by it and to embrace it and to, I don't know, treat it the same way I would treat speaking to an empty room, or speaking to my dog, or speaking to 500 people, or speaking to 2 people, in a yoga studio, or 40 people, whatever. So I'm really excited about that. But just to circle back, the reason why I haven't recorded a podcast in a few weeks is simply because the material that has sort of hit me, the stuff that I've been inspired by, I've been keeping for the show. And so, typically those things that download, those would be what I would sit down in front of the microphone for, that those would be the subjects that I would create episodes of the podcast for. So every time something has landed, I've been sort of adding it into not the script, but whatever, the document that I have for the show, and being very aware that would be an episode of the podcast, and thinking, shit, like, I know I said that there wasn't going to be a specific frequency with which episodes of the podcast were going to be released. But in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, just, be responsible and record an episode of the podcast. But I've stuck to my guns. And I've been very clear with myself that I wasn't going to just sit down in front of the microphone for the sake of sitting down and spewing some bullshit garbage episode so that, I could keep up appearances and remain consistent. I'd rather sit down when there is quality. I'd rather sit down when there is real inspiration, something worth sharing. And now I find myself in front of the microphone. And that's because there is something that hit me. And I don't know, will it pop up in the show? Maybe. But I think it's really important for me to talk about now. When I was, I want to say, let's say, what year was it? 18, 19. At that point, I had dropped out of school. After high school, I had gone on to CEGEP, which in Quebec is sort of college, I suppose. It's between high school and university. And I had gone from a very, very sheltered, structured high school to having so many options and absolutely no structure. All the structure had to be self-imposed with college. And to make a long story short, I was in the process of trying to figure myself out in the world. And I've ranted about it in the past, but I didn't find that the educational system was where I needed to be right there and right then. I needed to figure out who I was and what I was doing in the world and who I wanted to hang out with. And it was really a period of discovery. And school had very little to do with it. And there was a period between having dropped out of school and having gone to work. And it was in that period where I felt incredibly, incredibly, incredibly lost and really felt like there was no guidance. And I also was, hanging out with people who I had just met, and I wasn't sure if I was comfortable in that environment. And to make a very long story short, I had a lot of anxiety. And the anxiety started to manifest as if I ate, I would have to throw up after. And it wasn't something that I made myself do. It wasn't like I had to, position myself over the toilet and make myself gag until I threw up. It wasn't that at all. It happened on its own. It was like this low-level anxiety that if food hit my stomach, it would just come back up. And I could control when it came back up, but it was an effort. And it was really, really, really unpleasant. And I didn't really tell anybody about it. No one knew about it. What my family and some of my friends knew about was that I wasn't in school, I wasn't working, and I was a little bit lost. That's it. And so one day my grandmother contacted me and wanted to take me out for lunch. And I think she wanted to have a conversation with me to try and guide me and to try and offer something that would be helpful. And she actually did. I'll never forget it. I met her downtown and we went to a restaurant, and I remember I had a salad. And I was so nervous about eating. I was so nervous about eating. And she told me about emotional intelligence. She had read this book called Emotional Intelligence, and she had said to me, this is something that you have. So, this thing with school that's not working out, understand that there are, book smarts and there's street smarts, but there's also this, like emotional smarts, and you have that. And this is something that is going to take you further than if you didn't have it, but just went to school and studied something for the rest of your life. And I'll never forget it, because she really gave me something that helped me restore a sense of hope into my equation when there really wasn't any. I felt very, very, very lost. Anyway, I had lunch with her. I knew that I was going to be sick, or like I needed to be sick. And so I went through the motions of saying goodbye to her and leaving the restaurant. And I remember watching her leave in the other direction. And then I went back to the restaurant and I went to the bathroom and I was sick. And I remember in that moment I thought, okay, that's it. I'm not doing this again. So whatever else needs to happen is going to happen. But this is not okay. And it never happened again. But I understood exactly how anxiety could manifest and how it could work on my nervous system, and how ultimately it could leave me feeling horrible. Literally, that feeling after you've been sick in a fucking restaurant downtown after eating with my grandmother. Like, what the hell? That's not supposed to be an event that ended like that, but it did. Anyway, I don't know if I've told this story as well in an episode of the podcast, but I'm going to. Around the same time, about 17, 18, 19, when I was not quite dropped out of school. So it must have been slightly before. I wasn't quite dropped out of school, but I was heading there. I remember being at home on a weekday afternoon. It was 5 or 5:30. I think it was actually 5 and 5:30. So let's say 5 p.m. onwards. And I remember being in the den of my parents' home, and I was watching Roseanne. And this thought hit me just like, this is just what I want. I just want to be comfortable. I want to escape. I love this show. Right now I feel so good. I just want this. This is what I want for my life. And I knew that, there were expectations. I had to go out there and figure out what I wanted to study and figure out what I wanted to do for a living and figure out how I was going to earn money and figure out how I was going to get, my independence. And just the pressure of all that just made me just want to sink deeper into the sofa watching Roseanne. But I really distinctly remember that thought, this is what I want. This is what I want to do. Last year, I was home on a Wednesday afternoon. It was 3:30. I had one appointment with a client for a coaching mentoring session here at my home. And I had another one, but I had some time in between. So I sat down on the couch and I started watching an episode of The Conners. The Conners is just the spin-off from Roseanne after Roseanne got the boot from her own show. And I'm watching The Conners. And as I'm watching it, all of a sudden, this thought like lightning flashes into my head. Oh my God, this is it. You did it. And then this other part of me was like, what do you mean I did it? It was like this internal dialogue was happening, this internal tennis match. And all of a sudden, the original sort of flash of insight was like, you're at home, essentially watching Roseanne, but without Roseanne. And you're financially independent, and you've made your way into the world. And this is a full fucking circle moment. This is a full circle moment. And I swear to God, I remember once it really downloaded and hit me, I sat there on the couch numb. I was so shocked at how that loop closed. And I've done an episode of the podcast about cycles, but and this is no different really, just seen through a different lens. But I realized, wow, there's nothing for nothing. And that's what I wanted to talk to you about now. I believe that every single I believe, and I know from my experience, that every single thing that happens, regardless of how innocuous it may seem or how insignificant it may seem, it doesn't happen for nothing. I believe that what happens at any given point, something we overhear, something we experience that we don't even give a second thought to because we don't even consider that it might be significant, it happens so that later on this chronological journey of life, later on we will realize, oh, that happened for this moment to, connect to, for this to be looping with. I told you about the anxiety that I had that would result in me being sick as a kid because last week I had a session with somebody, a mentoring coaching session with somebody who came to my home who essentially told me that he was going through the same thing. Debilitating anxiety, inability to keep food down, low-level nausea all the time, and told me that, there had been experiences with psychologists before. And trust me, as a kid, I had these as well, and not one of them did a damn thing. And please hear me when I say this, I am not discrediting psychology or psychiatry or anything, but it never worked for me. It never worked for me because, to a certain extent, I didn't give them all the information, but I also believe that when I did give them all the information, it was almost like they couldn't connect to me in a human way. They could connect to me in a, this is the way I'm supposed to go about it way. And if I don't feel that human connection, my time is short in this body, in this life. I've got other shit to do. So I'll deal with it myself. And so, I was speaking to this guy, and he was telling me that this was happening. And I basically said to him, I know exactly what you're talking about because I've lived it. And I told him about my experience. And to make a long story short, I think it touched him on a level that he wasn't expecting, and that actually made a difference, because not only did I give him tactics to deal with the anxiety and the suffering that he was experiencing, but I wasn't giving him some theoretical textbook bullshit. I was giving him the stuff that worked for me. And for me to say to him, I know exactly what your suffering is like because I have been there, with symptoms and characteristics that are, for all intents and purposes, very specific, and I would think somewhat unusual, that really landed with him. And he understood that not only did I hear him when he was being blatantly truthful with me, but I could also meet it and tell him, okay, I know your pain. There is a path out of this. This is not the cross that you have to bear for the rest of your life. Let's do this. It hit me a couple of hours after I saw him that again a loop was closing. That again something that had happened in my earlier experiences in life, in the early part of this narrative of the Bramness, wasn't for nothing. I didn't suffer that simply because life is hard and fuck you. I experienced it to understand just to what degree that kind of suffering can affect someone, and never really forgot it. And lo and behold, almost 30 years later, someone walks into my home and tells me that they're going through it. And I understood something, I guess I was reminded of something that I talk a lot about. But suffering doesn't happen for nothing. I believe that suffering happens to every single one of us in different ways, manifesting as different waves with different labels. But ultimately, the ocean of suffering is the same. The label that is affixed to your suffering is specific to your experience, but it is suffering. We all understand suffering. And I believe that whatever version your suffering takes, it's happening for you to work with in a very psychological and spiritual way. We have a choice, even though we're not awake to that choice typically when we're in the thralls of suffering or the throes of suffering. I believe that if you have experienced some sort of suffering, then you know exactly what it feels like. And if you know exactly what it feels like, then you can be there for someone else who understands exactly what it feels like, but doesn't think that anybody else understands and that anybody else can relate or that anybody else can guide them out of it. And this is simply the shit that they got to deal with, and it might kill them. For a lot of people who suffer on this level, they do believe that there is no one out there who understands. And, for some of them, it becomes the burden that becomes too heavy that they don't want to carry and can contribute to suicidal thoughts and perhaps actions. I have a lot of opinions about suicidal thoughts and people who do take their own lives. I don't want to be irresponsible in saying this, but I just need to say that, when someone does take their own life, everyone else reacts in a way like, oh, that's not the answer and that shouldn't be the way you deal with it. And I'm not condoning or excusing someone who takes their own life. However, it's really easy for everybody else to say, well, that's not the answer. Reach out to somebody. If you don't understand the degree of suffering that someone is feeling, then you can't judge what they do with it. I understand that depth. I've had those thoughts. Very early on in my life, I had those thoughts. And what separated me from someone else who took their life and I didn't? I don't know. I'm not really sure. I've always held on to hope. And again, I've always had this core belief that everything was going to be okay. So I would like to think that that had something to do with it. But I believe that for someone who is suffering so much pain, that the thought of just ending their own life is the only way to alleviate being under that constant pressure, I can't stand a judgment. Now, hear me very fucking clearly. I'm not excusing it, I'm not condoning it, and I'm not saying that that is the right thing to do. But in the absence of there being enough resources for people who are living that, what does one do? We need to be better. And it's not just a question of saying I'm here. It's a question of saying I'm empathetic and I understand suffering and I'm going to speak to you on a level of suffering, but I'm going to keep you connected to hope. And I'm going to do this even if it's inconvenient to me, and I'm going to be there and I'm going to accompany you because that's why we're fucking here. We are here to accompany each other, especially through the shadow, especially through the tougher moments. So when I spoke to this guy in this session, I really understood that there was a real significance in our exchange. It meant something. It meant something to him, something that I don't think he was getting anywhere else. And when I realized that that was the loop closing from, my experience as a kid, it became one of those moments where I sat back and thought, wow, I'm doing exactly what I should be doing. I don't take a lot of time to pat myself on the back. I don't take a lot of time to look back on the things I've done and congratulate myself. It's not about that. It typically is I do something, there's something else coming, so I get from one thing to the next thing to the next thing. And hopefully I'm leaving an imprint in the world that respects the integrity of how I want to show up, right? It's the echo that I want to leave in my wake. After that meeting with this guy, I felt like I had done that. I felt like I'm standing in my purpose, and I just made a fucking difference. I made a difference. Thank God I made a difference. And thank God I survived my childhood. And thank God I remember the suffering, the degree of suffering, and how physically not well I felt, so that I can express it to him and he can understand that I understood how he was feeling. And hopefully break the loop that he was finding himself in, by introducing something that hadn't been introduced into that loop, and that was someone else who understands, someone who is not a parent or a friend who has a vested interest, right? But someone who's more or less objective, and someone who's lived it and could provide real-time, really valuable, helpful tactics that the second he tried in front of me, they worked. So right there, I felt like, you know what? It's all for something. If I understand that my suffering is not simply a test that I've got to survive, but rather a tool that I could hide away in my toolbox, recover from, hide away in my toolbox, and then pull it back out when someone else who is going through the same degree of suffering and potentially living the exact same experience, when they come to me, I can pull that out and say, here, check this out. And look what I've done with it. And you can do that with it. And you will most likely have someone come to you in 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years with the same thing, so that you can pass it on to them, and we can be responsible for not only bringing each other away from that place where we think that taking one's life is the only way out, but we can raise our vibration and our awareness to understand that we are here to close these circles. We are here to do it with each other. We are here to heal. And listen, I can honestly say that I think that moment with him was as healing for him as it was for me. And it was as healing for me as it was for him. I don't think that anything is happening by accident. I think that each one of these narratives is specific And if we keep on searching for the meaning behind it, the meaningfulness, not necessarily just being mindful to it, but searching for the meaning that informs all of these things, I think that we are more powerful than we know. I think that we're more powerful than anybody has told us we are. And it simply speaks to what I already know. That what one has suffered is meant to be the sword of power that one brandishes when there is, or when it seems like there is no hope, or when someone living in a state of no hope comes to us. However they find their way to us, this is when that sword needs to come out. We need to understand that what we have suffered is meant to empower us, not to deplete us. So I'm telling you all this for you to consider that the things that you have survived aren't for nothing. And if you have had these moments of the loop closing, recognize it. If you haven't yet, I want you to consider what those moments are in your past that potentially are the beginning of a loop that might end up closing soon enough. And maybe is only making sense to you now that you're hearing me talk about these stories. If you have stories of your own that echo this, or if this is bringing up anything that you would like to talk about, or, I don't know, just bounce off of me, please feel free to reach out. However you reach out to me, whether it's email, social media, whatever. But understand that I felt compelled to sit down in front of the microphone and talk about this stuff that I've never really spoken about, but stuff that I used to think was painfully personal, and I realize is not. None of this is meant to be personal. It's all meant to be communal. It's meant to be collaborative. It's meant to be shared. It's meant to be reflected back to me so that it could be reflected back to you. And ultimately, my experience is meant to mirror back to you your experience. The show that I'm going to do later on in the year is going to be called Storyteller. And it's going to be a lot of stories, very, very funny, and some thought-provoking, some a little bit, poignant. But ultimately, it's going to be me telling a lot of stories so that hopefully everyone in attendance can see themselves reflected back to themselves. Because ultimately, the details of the story, the details of the suffering, the details of the joy may differ, but it's all the same. We're all living the same experience. Anyway, with all of that said, I'm very happy I got back in front of the microphone. It is very cathartic for me, and it makes me feel good knowing that I'm reaching people in a different way. And so I hope that you found something of value in this. Feel free to reach out and let me know. And, I'll see you later. This has been the Examine Life with Bram Levinson.